Good evening and welcome. My name is Bruce Campbell. I'm the director of the Latino Latin American Studies program at College of St. Benedict, St. John's University. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement that both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupy the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the indigenous peoples forcibly removed from this territory, whose connection remains today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Now, students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relationships with our Native Nation neighbors. Tonight's event is the second in our fall 2022 Latino Latin American Studies program series on the theme of labor. We hope you will join us again for our final event on Thursday, November 10th, when artist Bobby Marines will present Cotton Picker, which will explore the intersection of labor, art, and community. This semester's series centers on the concept of labor. Labor is both an economic category and input in capitalist economics, as in the labor market, labor costs, etc., and is a lived human reality, an embodied position within economic structures and a kind of creative agency or power. Labor, in other words, is both a thing and an embodied experience. As a thing, labor has a price and is used like other economic resources to accomplish defined goals, turning a profit, creating and distributing a thing, etc. As lived human reality, the economic abstraction of labor becomes visible as the field worker, the barista, the house painter, the construction worker, the landscaper, and the actor and the artist and the teacher. Importantly, there are also forms of labor that are necessary to the maintenance of a healthy community and society, but they're often not recognized as formal inputs for the economy: raising children, mutual aid, volunteer work, and other kinds of community care that are not transactional. The thingification of labor often includes the unjust treatment of the laboring person. Historically, labor exploitation has taken many different forms. Our speaker this evening, Dr. Benjamin Narvaez, will talk to us about Chinese indentured labor during the era of abolition, Cuba, Peru, and the United States during the mid-19th century. Dr. Narvaez is Associate Professor of History at the University of Minnesota Morris, where he is the coordinator of the Latin American Area Studies program. His research focuses on the history of Chinese migration to Latin America, especially Chinese indentured labor in 19th century Cuba and Peru, and Chinese immigration to early 20th century Costa Rica. His work has appeared in various journals, including the Journal of Social History, the Americas, and the New West Indian Guide, as well as edited volumes. Please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Benjamin Narvaez.
Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you all for being here. And I'm excited to be able to talk to you about this topic. And so this evening, I want to discuss the history of Chinese indentured labor in Cuba, Peru, and the U.S. South. And I'm guessing you're somewhat familiar with the history of Chinese labor in the U.S. West, which was sort of at the same time, but less so with this history of Chinese indentured labor in these other places, including in the U.S. South, this brief moment in the U.S. South. And I and many would argue that it was indentured Chinese labor that approximated chattel slavery the most in terms of these different Chinese laboring experiences in the Americas. So this evening I want to explain Chinese indentured labor in Cuba and Peru, and then consider how and why Southern planters sought to copy Cuba, and why their experiment fizzled out so quickly in comparison. Ultimately, I think this subject deepens our understanding of the transition from slavery to free labor, and of how the Chinese were racialized in the Americas. And it also highlights Asia's historical connections to Latin America, something that's often overlooked, and encourages thinking about U.S. Latin American connections in new ways. So when abolition finally occurred in the United States, it forced planters in the South to consider new sources and forms of labor, and some looked to Spanish America for answers. Cuba had long played a prominent role in the U.S. imagination because of its proximity, geostrategic location, and potential as a slave state. so before abolition in the US. But even as the United States embraced abolition and Cuba maintained slavery, which it would do until 1886, the island presented Southern planters with potential labor solutions. Cuban elites had been using male Chinese indentured workers, commonly known as coolies in English or colonos asiáticos in Spanish, to supplement slave labor and delay the rise of free labor since 1847. So that's when they started to use these Chinese workers. Planters in coastal Peru similarly embraced Chinese indentured labor in 1849, a few years before abolition occurred in that country. Before the Civil War, Southerners had noted but were skeptical of these developments. However, their concerns receded once legal slavery ended in the US. Planters wanted cheap exploitable labor, which indentured Chinese appeared to offer. Thus, during Reconstruction, Southern elites attempted to use Chinese indentured labor to minimize changes in labor relations. And yet these efforts didn't go very well. Southerners had a harder time recruiting, exploiting, controlling, and retaining Chinese workers in comparison to Cuba and Peru. This is not to say that Chinese indentured labor was an unquestioned success from an elite Cuban, Peruvian perspective of the time. Compared to African slavery, coolie labor was short-lived. Nevertheless, between 1847 and 1874, about 250,000 Chinese left for Cuba and Peru. So if we look at the map, what we're talking about is mostly Chinese migrants from southern China going across the Pacific in the mid-19th century to work in the US West and up into California and down into Australia as well. But then this development of this trade in Chinese indentured laborers to Spanish America, mainly to Cuba, and those workers went around the Indian Ocean, around Africa, across the Atlantic, then back over here. And the Chinese in Peru went across the Pacific. And so this was about 25 years or 26 years in Cuba of this quarter century in Cuba and Peru, about 250,000. Chinese indentured labor in the U.S. South, in contrast, lasted only a few years and provided virtually no labor shortage reprieve. So the question I ask is, why did these outcomes differ so much? Race, abolition, Chinese resistance, and international relations all interacted to shape and undermine Chinese indentured labor. Nevertheless, I argue the state was central to making or breaking the coolie labor system. In particular, the strength, goals, and actions of states in transition helped determine coolie labor's viability. Cuba had a relatively strong colonial government that maintained Cuban elite loyalty during a time of independence and abolition elsewhere through its support of slavery and coolie labor. Peru, in contrast, was an incipient nation-state that abolished slavery in 1854. However, its national government was weak and virtually absent in the countryside, and therefore incapable of protecting the Chinese. In the United States, Southern planters turned to Chinese labor following a massive civil war in which the federal government had triumphed and now committed itself to dismantling slavery and its legacy. Federal power diminished after Reconstruction, but when the South flirted with coolie labor, a relatively strong U.S. federal government and its Republican allies and state government were generally anti-planter, increasingly feared the Chinese as a racial group, and viewed coolie labor as akin to slavery, all of which led them to oppose coolie labor and refuse to enforce labor contracts and hunt down and return Chinese workers to plantations. In developing this argument, I seek to balance local, national, comparative, and transnational history so as to better understand how debates and actions concerning race and labor interacted across borders, while also shedding light on important points of divergence and reasons for points of convergence between these places. In fact, by comparing and drawing connections between these places, we can not only better understand the transition to free labor in Cuba and Peru, but also the successes and failures of Reconstruction. But before I try to explain this history more, I think it's necessary to sort of pause and better define the term coolie, a word that can be pejorative if not properly contextualized. When scholars use the term, they are referring to a specific period of Asian labor migration during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Nevertheless, they disagree on who exactly was a coolie. Some use it broadly for Chinese Asian workers, while others, including myself, use it more narrowly to refer to indentured Asian workers. Although similarities in the experience of indentured and non-indentured Chinese existed, using coolie for all workers papers over important differences. The experience of the indentured approximated slavery the most. Chinese in the U.S. West did not arrive under contract. Instead, they went under the credit ticket system, borrowing money to pay for a passage. These debts clearly served as mechanisms of control and led to exploitation. But Chinese in California emigrated more willingly and had greater mobility than the indentured elsewhere. The narrower use of this term, I think, is also warranted because its application to non-indentured Asian workers was often intended to link them to indentured ones so as to denigrate and exclude them from society. So despite its ambiguous nature, the term was intrinsically linked to a historical episode in Cuba, Peru, the British Empire, which also had Asian indentured labor, and briefly the US South. So Cuba turned to Chinese indentured workers in 1847 due to concerns over race and labor. Sugar relied on slavery, and that was the primary crop in Cuba. But growing international and domestic pressure against this institution led some Cubans to contemplate alternative labor supplies. China became an attractive option because the British had recently opened China up to the West following the Opium Wars. And this was particularly true in southern China. And many Chinese, especially in the South, hoped to escape hardship caused by overpopulation, government corruption, famine, and civil unrest. So most Chinese were leaving Guangdong province in the south, and most of the Chinese heading into the British Empire or going to California in the 19th century were leaving out of Hong Kong. That was sort of their point of departure. But the Spanish-American coolie trade, to Cuba first, and then Peru as well, most Chinese were leaving out of the Portuguese-controlled port of Macau. So there were sort of two central points where Chinese were leaving, and first to Cuba, beginning in 1847. In Cuba, Chinese workers were also attractive because they were neither European, which made justifying their exploitation in the minds of the elite easier, and they weren't black, which assuaged racial anxieties and could potentially help divide plantation workforces and prevent a Haitian-style slave rebellion, which Cuban elites were terrified of. Right? Cuba took advantage of the Haitian Revolution to become the world's biggest sugar producer in the 19th century and expanded slavery on the island, but it terrified the elite at the same time. Unlike Cuba, Peru was a young, independent, liberal republic without slavery during most of the coolie era. During the first 30 years of independence, slavery was gradually undermined by the Independence War, political instability, economic difficulties, and the growth of liberalism and abolitionism. However, just as legal slavery was ending, the guano industry and the coastal sugar and cotton plantations boomed, thereby creating this new demand for labor. Attracting native labor from the highlands seemed too difficult and costly based on a history of indigenous local autonomy, and dreams of European immigration also failed to materialize. Consequently, Peruvian planters looked across the Pacific to China, and by 1849, Chinese started arriving, and then abolition happened in 1854, and that's when this trade in Chinese laborers really took off to Peru. So by 1874, roughly 125,000 and 92,000 indentured Chinese laborers, nearly all men, respectively had entered Cuba and Peru at that point. A lot of them to work on sugar plantations, cotton plantations, on railroads, in mines, on guano pits, and as urban and as domestic workers as well. So all sectors of the economy. In Cuba, on the left, most Chinese were in the western half of the island. That was the heart of the sugar industry in the 19th century. That's where most slaves lived. The 20th century, sugar would move to the east. But in the 19th century, sugar and slavery, existed everywhere, but especially in the west. And that's where the Chinese found themselves working as well. Also in tobacco fields and coffee plantations. But then in cities like Havana or Matanzas, I can't really read this, I think Matanzas is right there, Sagua La Grande, other cities like that as well. In urban sort of industries, candle making, cigar rolling, etc. And in Peru, almost all the Chinese ended up on the coast. They weren't up in the highlands or really on the back Amazonian side of Peru. By the Chincha Islands, they worked in guano, but most of this was cotton and sugar plantations along the coast, and then also those urban jobs in cities like Lima or Trujillo as well. In Cuba and Peru, the Chinese experienced a middle ground between free labor and slavery. Coolies were legally free individuals who signed 8-year labor contracts that required patronos, so the term for their employers, required patronos to pay 4 pesos a month to them and to provide adequate food and health care and allow for days of rest, like Sundays. And the Chinese were theoretically free after completing these contracts. And this is a copy of one of those contracts from Cuba. So they were translated into Chinese. Those are lots of the little fine point stipulations in the contracts, right? There's more to them than what I just said, but I gave you the highlights of a contract. In a lot of cases, the Chinese didn't really understand what they were signing. Even though it's translated, it was still not really clear. So not surprisingly, in many respects, their experience resembled slavery. Recruiters used deception and force, kidnappings, etc., to get signatures on contracts. The voyage echoed the African Middle Passage as thousands died from imprisonment, beatings, malnourishment, and unhygienic conditions. Once in Spanish America, coolies seldom received their pay and adequate care. Instead, they were treated as chattel and faced long work hours and abuse, 20-hour workdays, constant whippings, imprisonment, shackles, and high death rates. Patronos often forced coolies to work beyond the original contract as well. Many Chinese in Cuba worked alongside slaves, African slaves, in a slave society, which encouraged exploitation. But as Peru shows, abolition did not preclude abuse. Regardless of legal abolition, both societies experienced tension between preserving traditions of slavery and forced labor and embracing liberal progress at the same time. And I think that tension is reflected in sort of their status and their actual daily experiences. You can see sort of the slave-like nature of Chinese indentured labor in Cuba In these images from Harper's from the early 1960s, there was an embedded reporter who went on this coolie ship from Macau to Norway in 1857, and there was this uprising, Chinese mutiny because of the treatment. And then he wrote this really negative story for the American audience about the abuse, this new form of slavery. But these images from that Harper's is showing sort of the lining them up, right? They're confined below deck, the whippings that occurred during the voyage. And the death rate, I should mention, was like, on average, like 12 to 15%. So it was pretty high. And here are images from the era, like on the upper left, Chinese laborers and labor in Peru. This is probably about 1880, this photograph, at the very end of the coolie era in Peru. The one on the right, upper right, is a famous French artist who depicted what he saw of Chinese workers in the 1860s in Cuba's cane fields. And then below, you see Chinese laborers and being linked to the Narvaez cigar factory. So like I said, it wasn't just sugar, even if that was the dominant industry in which they worked. So this tension between slavery and liberal progress led to the ambivalent racialization of the Chinese. On the one hand, coolies were free men and a positive social element. Unlike slaves, they signed contracts and received wages. In Cuba, the Chinese were also legally white and therefore not slaves. So in various ways, the courts and the government upheld their legal whiteness. In Peru, abolition similarly assured free status, theoretical free status for the Chinese. Calling coolies colonos or colonists, contratados, contracted, or referring to them as free laborers, further distinguished them from slaves. Many also praised the Chinese for being hard workers, skilled, respectful, intelligent, cultured, moral, and capable of assimilating. But on the other hand, coolies were often linked with slaves and deemed racial and social menaces. So there's sort of these competing discourses. Some laws undermined their rights and reflected slave codes. Cubans and Peruvians also often used the language of slavery to discuss these workers. Coolies often were referred to as esclavos, slaves. They were often called property, like mi propiedad. That people talked about buying and selling them like they were property. And employers were often referred to by government officials as owners. Like I look at a lot of criminal cases and they're referred to as the dueño instead of patrono. Although they often use patrono, they often say dueño. Ex-coolies were libre, or free. They were asiáticos libres, free Asians. And runaways were called cimarrones, the term for runaway slave. I even found a few documents in Cuba a long time ago that referred to new Chinese arrivals as bozales. Bozal is the term for a newly arrived slave in Cuba. Many also called the Chinese lazy, weak, dishonest, rebellious, savage, and morally corrupt too. So there's sort of this praise on the one hand and sort of calling them these degenerates on the other hand. These clashing views initially facilitated coolie labor. Insisting coolies were free laborers and worthy immigrants justified letting them in, and exploitation and abuse could be ignored by insisting the law protected the Chinese and they had willingly signed contracts that they needed to fulfill. Of course, racializing them as subhuman slaves and as a social cancer also legitimized exploitation. However, these contradictions eventually helped undercut the coolie trade because domestic and international critics could condemn the slave-like treatment of supposedly free, cultured men and or embrace xenophobic, anti-Chinese views and advocate for Chinese exclusion. If they're so bad, then let's stop them from coming. Chinese also challenged this labor system themselves. Coolies slowed their work, struck, practiced sabotage, stole, petitioned officials, saved money to purchase their freedom, forged documents, ran away, committed suicide, rebelled, and assaulted and violently attacked their superiors. These actions didn't always succeed in an immediate sense, but they cumulatively weakened this labor system by making Chinese suffering visible to domestic and international eyes, and slowly, in the process, also creating this free Chinese community in the two places. By 1874, international pressure led Portugal to close Macau to the coolie trade, thereby dooming coolie labor in Spanish America, since this was the place where all these workers were leaving from. During the 1850s, a minority of Americans looked to Cuba and Peru and advocated Chinese indentured labor for the South. Some Northerners promoted these workers as a step toward free labor, a step away from slavery, while a handful of Southerners believed adopting coolie labor could sort of stave off pressures against the institution of slavery. Nevertheless, the linking of coolies to slavery and more general white racial anxiety, including the rising anti-Chinese movement in California, increasingly led Northerners and Westerners to condemn coolie labor leading up to the Civil War. And before the Civil War, the majority of Southern planters joined this chorus against Chinese indentured labor for the South. But this wasn't so much because they were worried it looked like slavery. They thought maybe it would harm the institution of slavery, like it would be a step in the other direction. So they were against it. The Civil War had a mixed effect on the coolie question. Responding to mounting criticism of coolie labor, the federal government banned American participation in the coolie trade in 1862, linking it clearly to the illegal African slave trade. 3 years later, slavery itself ended in the US. But was coolie labor itself illegal in the US? And what exactly was a coolie? The answers were obvious to some and less so to others. Coolies, or the idea of coolies, remained somewhat ambiguous, giving them another chance in the South as the labor situation changed following the Civil War. Free blacks refused to work for low wages, and planters hesitated to embrace sharecropping, fearing a loss of control. Indentured Asians suddenly seemed more attractive. Southern rhetoric switched from coolies undermining slavery to coolies saving the social and economic order. So many Southern planters and others had suddenly done this 180. Efforts to use Chinese indentured labor in the South, however, bore little fruit. Only several thousand Chinese from China, the Caribbean, and California arrived in the South during Reconstruction. And most of those who ended up in the South ended up in Texas, Alabama, and those were mostly railroads in those two areas, but then especially in Louisiana on sugar plantations. But still, small number compared to Cuba and Peru. So if the total numbers differed, so did the experience. The Chinese were never docile, but Southern planters found it harder to retain them, neutralize resistance, and profit off of them. Unlike in Cuba and Peru, Chinese indentured labor in the South did little to help delay the shift to free labor. What accounts for this failure in the South as compared to Cuba and Peru? Again, slavery, abolition, contradictory racial tropes, Chinese resistance, and international politics all shaped the trajectory of coolie labor in the Americas. But the relative strength and goals of the state were central to these different outcomes. In the case of Cuba, it had a strong colonial government that upheld slavery to maintain planter class loyalty. Officials allowed the clandestine slave trade to operate into the mid-1860s in Cuba. And they rarely punished masters for violating slaves' rights. The colonial government also tracked down, detained, and returned runaway slaves, and used military force to stop slave rebellion on the island. Colonial authorities also restricted the freedom of, and mobility of free people of color on the island. The colonial governments response to the coolie trade and coolie labor largely mirrored its defense of slavery. At times, colonial officials upheld the free status of the Chinese and defended them, but more often than not, they didn't. They did the opposite. So Spain and Cuba and the colonial Cuban government did more to sustain coolie labor than undermine it. Spanish consular officials in Macau were required to ensure that all Chinese had signed their contracts willingly and they understood what they were signing up for, and that the ships were not overcrowded and had proper ventilation and supplies. However, they regularly ignored these abuses. They just signed off. And like every case is a violation, basically, of the rules. Cuba's colonial government ignored abuse in the coolie trade as well. Colonial officials were required to conduct investigations and find ships that broke the law, but they rarely criticized or punished coolie traders. And they often did an investigation if there was a high death rate, but instead of really blaming the abuse and the terrible conditions, they blamed opium use by the Chinese instead. With little to fear, coolie importers continued to overcrowd ships and abuse passengers. Spain and the colonial government also enabled exploitation inside of Cuba. The law allowed patronos to treat coolies like virtual slaves. When Chinese signed contracts, they had to give up poorly defined civil rights that conflicted with their labor obligations. These aren't really clearly spelled out, but it's in the contract, and so that kind of opened the door for extensive abuse. The punishments patronos could legally mete out were also harsh. Corporal punishment was initially legal, but even after regulations in 1854 banned whippings, employers still could withhold wages and use stocks and chains legally. Patronos, in contrast, faced minimal punishment for violating the contract or coolie regulations, including continuing to use whippings into the 1870s. By creating the infrastructure to put down slave and coolie rebellion, the colonial government also provided planters and others with physical and psychological support that made them feel secure in exploiting slaves and coolies. Cuban planters permitted this government presence in the countryside if it meant protection from rebellion. In fact, the Guardia Civil, or the Rural Guard, helped put down coolie uprisings on multiple occasions. So Chinese started to rebel en masse on a plantation, and quickly the Civil Guard came and put it down. The colonial government also actively strove to keep Chinese laboring while under contract. The law required coolies to carry identification papers at all times, and they needed written permission from their employer to leave a work site. Otherwise, the authorities could arrest them. Free Chinese had to register with the government as well, another safeguard against runaways. Moreover, colonial authorities regularly tracked down runaways, placing them in a deposito de cimarrones, a depot, a jail for runaways, including with runaway slaves. And they held them there until their employers could retrieve them. Officials also raided the free Chinese community, hoping to find runaways, and they published notices of captured runaways in the newspapers, just like slave runaway announcements, right? Just listed descriptions of the individuals, etc. And they were right next to those slave runaways in the papers as well. The colonial government further limited coolie mobility and protected patronos' rights by enacting fines and threatening imprisonment for third parties who harbored or contracted runaway Chinese, trying to prevent that from happening. The colonial government additionally supported patronos by making it difficult for coolies to attain freedom after they finished their contracts. An 1860 royal decree gave these individuals 2 months to recontract, leave the island, or be forced to go do public works. Most Chinese had no money for their passage. 4 pesos was like a month, which they often didn't get, was about 20% of what a normal sort of field wage laborer earned, so they had like no money. And so this law essentially sentenced them to perpetual servitude, whether that was doing public works or recontracting. Still, some evaded this law and joined free society, but it wasn't easy. Gaining legal free status involved procuring a number of documents, including proof of finishing the contract, baptismal certificate, you had to become Catholic, you had to then get a letter of domicile, and then there were all a bunch of documents after that. But these papers cost money, and officials could charge exorbitant fees for them, or withhold or steal them and make ex-coolies buy new ones or force them back into laboring under contract. This is an example of one of those letters of domicile from Cuba that a Chinese ex-coolie was able to obtain in 1865. And so this was like the third or fourth paper in that process, right? And then there's renewing it and other papers to not be forced back onto a plantation. Ultimately, by the early 1870s, 20 to 25% were in this sort of a precarious free status. The vast majority still laboring under contract or had died laboring under contract. Finally, in terms of Cuba, government support for the coolie labor system also existed through non-action. The law may have suggested some official concern for coolies, but enforcement was minimal. Abuse, including corporal punishment, rarely led to punishment for overseers and patronos. Officials could legally visit and monitor plantations and monitor the treatment that slaves and Chinese workers were receiving, but they almost never did unless the Chinese directly complained, like ran away and complained to a local official. And even then, when investigations did occur, patronos and overseers were rarely ever found guilty, and even if they were hardly punished at all, minor fines, even in cases of death. Too many officials sympathized with employers and not the Chinese in Cuba. Peru's coolie experience resembled Cuba's in many ways. Although all men were legally free and equal in Peru, not women, but men, the post-colonial state failed to make equality a reality. Peruvian officials on both sides of the Pacific failed to curb abuses in the coolie trade despite laws to the contrary, just like in Cuba. The Peruvian government at the local and national level also failed to enforce laws aimed at protecting Chinese workers inside of the country. And when they did punish employers, punishments also tended to be insignificant. So there's a lot of overlap here. Again, officials in Peru often refused to give the proper papers to free Chinese or confiscated these papers as well. And they also tried to prevent runaways like their Cuban counterparts, fining and punishing third parties for harboring runaways, again raiding the free Chinese community, capturing and imprisoning runaways, and again publishing notices of captured Chinese runaways. Although fewer protective regulations existed for the Chinese in Peru, and there were these similar experiences in many respects, it did not mean that Peru's government sided more with patronos than Cuba's. In fact, as a liberal state and not a colonial slave regime, abuse did produce concern within the Peruvian national government. So there's a lot of talk about it. Nevertheless, Peru was slower to develop detailed coolie regulations, in part because abolition and the 1860 Constitution theoretically prevented their enslavement and ensured theoretically equality. The fact that the Peruvian Congress, voted against a forced recontracting law like Cuba's in 1870 provides further evidence of a government unwilling to support planters to quite the same degree as in Cuba. Moreover, unlike Cuba, Peruvian officials occasionally went beyond fining abusive patronos and actually freed Chinese whose contracts and rights had been violated. Now, this is a minority of cases, but I found evidence of that happening there, and I've never seen it happen in Cuba. But overall, the national government was too weak to protect Chinese laborers in the countryside. A relative lack of regulations protecting these workers also resulted from a central government struggling to consolidate itself. Limited resources went to protecting the government in power. defending the rights of the Chinese was not a priority. Officials in Lima were weary of alienating coastal elites with new regulations. Actually enforcing regulations and protecting the Chinese was even harder due to the state's weakness. On paper, power was centralized heavily in the hands of the president. But actual implementation of the chief executive's will depended on the cooperation of regional and local power brokers. Holding local officials accountable for not protecting the Chinese risked alienating crucial allies. Peruvian intellectual Felix Zegarra and U.S. Minister to Peru Christopher Robinson during this coolie era both noted how planters could exploit coolies with impunity because in some rural areas, officials were virtually absent. There's like no presence. Or when there were officials, they were more loyal to planters than the central government in Lima. So coolie labor's success depended on a strong supportive state in many respects, or a weak one incapable of challenging planter interests. Neither was true for the U.S. South during Reconstruction. During this period, the South experienced an assertive federal government and a Republican Party committed to ending slavery and promoting racial equality. This didn't last in the long run, but the defeat of the Confederacy, constitutional amendments banning slavery and guaranteeing equality regardless of race, the military occupation of the South, the lack of federal Republican desire to aid treasonous planters, the 1866 Civil Rights Act, and Republican control of state governments weakened Southern elites, and for a time, not for long, helped African Americans advance. This was not a setting conducive to coolie labor, especially when so many linked coolies to slavery at this point. Southerners also had to contend with a growing anti-Chinese movement by the time they were interested in these workers. So government officials in the US offered little support for Chinese indentured labor compared to their Cuban and Peruvian counterparts. Federal officials immediately opposed post-Civil War efforts to import coolies to the South. From 1865 to 1868, Southern labor speculators sought federal permission to import these workers, but the Bureau of Immigration repeatedly denied these requests, believing it violated the 1862 anti-coolie trade law and would create a new system of bonded labor in the US. But Southerners kept trying. Planters and their supporters insisted that the 1862 anti-coolie law did not apply to them. The law, they asserted, applied to the movement of unfree laborers from China. It didn't prevent American ships from carrying Chinese, nor Americans from contracting Chinese workers outside of the United States when both sides theoretically entered these agreements of their own volition. So if they were entered it freely. By 1867, labor recruiters in Louisiana obtained a few hundred Chinese workers from Cuba, so like after indenture in Cuba. But Spain soon after that moved to try to stop Chinese from leaving the island. So the search for coolies then shifted to China and Chinese in the US West. Efforts in China bore little fruit as well. Chinese hesitated to sign contracts, and the British in Hong Kong blocked recruitment by 1870, fearing exploitation. Macau at that point was a no-go. That was too associated with the idea of Chinese slavery. In the end, only two ships, the Ville de Saint Loup and the Charles Albert, left China, landing in New Orleans in 1870 with 169 and 220 Chinese laborers, respectively. Recruiting in California also stumbled, since the Chinese had greater economic opportunities out west, and they associated the South with slavery. Still, Southern railroad companies and planters, aided by mounting xenophobia in the West, recruited some California Chinese. So the Houston and Central Texas Railroad in Calvert, Texas, received 250 in 1869, and 963 went to Alabama to work on the Alabama-Chattanooga Railroad, and then a few more to the Selma and Gulf Railroad. And then several hundred ended up on the plantations in Louisiana as well. As this was happening, federal officials made it really clear that they opposed this, and they tried to stop it from continuing. In 1867, Republicans in Congress passed resolutions condemning coolie labor. This led Secretary of State William Seward to issue a circular calling on U.S. consuls abroad to stop the coolie trade to the United States. Consuls were required to verify that Chinese headed to the United States were free migrants. Nevertheless, determining who was and was not a coolie remained open to interpretation, as future conflicts between coolie importers and U.S. officials would demonstrate. Still, U.S. consuls in Cuba and China became more vigilant after Seward's circular, warning officials in the U.S. about schemes to import coolies, and this really made this really difficult to pull off then. So for example, in 1867, officials detained the William Robertson, which had left Cuba for New Orleans with Chinese laborers aboard, after the U.S. consul in Havana had sent letters to Washington warning officials there. So it was detained in New Orleans. For the next 3 years, Southerners still sought coolies from Cuba, but they continued to face this resistance from U.S. officials and Spanish officials in Cuba. Confusion concerning who a coolie was, and harassment from U.S. officials also impeded recruitment in China. In the end, it was only those 2 ships I mentioned that left China for Louisiana and for the U.S., since it became so hard to convince U.S. consular officials that Chinese workers in question weren't actually indentured. By mid-1870, California remained a possibility, but few Chinese still wished to go to the South. Federal hostility had clearly hindered the Southern coolie trade. Foreign governments and Chinese disinterest in the South only confounded these difficulties. Moreover, state and local governments in the South clearly opposed Chinese indentured labor as well. Coolie labor was banned in the Texas Constitution, like the 1867 Constitution. A lack of government support in other ways doomed coolie labor in the South. No Guardia Civil, or rural guard, existed to control coolies. The government never created coolie codes sanctioning exploitation, nor did it contemplate perpetual servitude laws, like in Cuba. No laws explicitly penalized hiring Chinese workers employed by others. Right? That would sort of go in contradict notions of free labor. Instead, during radical Reconstruction, the federal government and state allies were more committed to promoting equality. Of course, the push for equality ultimately failed. In 1870, Congress voted to prevent Chinese naturalization, a sign of where the country was heading. Moreover, in the long run, Jim Crow created second-class citizens, and federal officials completely forsook the Chinese with exclusion laws in 1882, banning Chinese immigration. But at the time that Southerners turned to coolie labor, radical Reconstruction and mounting anti-Chinese sentiment posed major obstacles. Coolie contracts and their enforcement in the South, and this is sort of the last idea I want to talk about, show how Reconstruction created this environment that was inconducive to this labor system. Chinese in Cuba and Peru signed 8-year transferable contracts, so people could just buy and sell them, like it's the contract, but it's really the people that they're buying and selling. And the contracts paid $4 or pesos a month and restricted civil rights, like I noted. Contracts in the South were non-transferable. They were shorter, they were for 1 to 3 years. The pay was $10 to $16 a month, and Chinese often tried to renegotiate the pay. And civil rights were not limited by the contracts. These differences occurred because state and federal officials during Reconstruction refused to sanction exploitation that turned individuals into temporary property. Instead, they largely let employers and employees work out labor relations on their own within the confines of the law. White Southerners suddenly had to negotiate with and control Chinese workers and non-white workers without strong government backing. and this wasn't so easy. In fact, local and state authorities rarely stopped Chinese from leaving work sites and finding new employment. They just picked up and left repeatedly. Hundreds of Chinese railroad workers in Texas and Alabama left their employers in 1870 and 1871, frustrated over pay, and they never faced any legal repercussions, even when the railroad sued. The owners of the Live Oaks and St. Louis plantations in Iberville Parish, Louisiana, watched in dismay in 1871 as their coolies left and local officials did little to force them to come back. By late 1871, most Chinese on the Malauden plantation in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, had left. Nearly all of the original Chinese on the Layton plantation in Lafourche Parish in Louisiana, near Thibodaux, abandoned their employer within a year, despite signing 3-year contracts as well. Other Louisiana planters, including in Terrebonne Parish, reported Chinese flight, too. This ability to pick up and leave contrasted sharply with Cuba and Peru. So, look, these parishes I mentioned are in the southeastern area of Louisiana, or in the sugar plantation zones. Terrebonne is there, Lafourche, Iberville, Jefferson. So that's sort of the area in Louisiana where they were mostly working, but some would then leave and go to like up north to Baton Rouge and work in the city and find jobs and things like that. This is also a depiction of those workers on Malauden Plantation in Jefferson Parish that I mentioned. Right? And this was titled Chinese Cheap Labor from the time, because that was the idea. It was going to be cheap, exploitable. But it wasn't really the case. Finally, when Chinese refused to work and demanded better pay and work conditions from their employers in the South could not count on government support. The owner of the Malauden plantation repeatedly had to renegotiate the terms of service in favor of his Asian workers because local authorities lent him little support. Violent confrontations even on Malauden, where the Chinese rebelled with violence, led to no punishment from the authorities and forced, again, this renegotiation in favor of the workers. So although government officials in the South often did not support coolies strongly, they did not enforce the contract on behalf of planters the way they did in Cuba and oftentimes in Peru. Employers and employees were left to figure out labor relations on their own, for the most part, which was a losing scenario for planters under the larger conditions of Reconstruction. In conclusion, Chinese indentured labor in the Americas offers an excellent opportunity to do national, international, comparative, and transnational history. Coolie labor in Cuba, Peru, and the U.S. South reveals substantial overlap. Slavery, abolition, and coolies were hotly debated issues, and these societies looked to each other for answers. Together, they also developed a contradictory discourse concerning the Chinese and coolie labor. But if these places were intimately linked, they also differed. Despite similar labor needs and similar ideas about the Chinese, coolie labor was more successful in Cuba and Peru than in the U.S. South. This is where national contexts enter the story. Differences in the agenda and strength of the state played key roles in these developments. In Cuba, a strong colonial government enabled coolie labor to flourish, whereas a weak national government in Peru led to a similar outcome. Southern planters lacked the proper variables to successfully adopt Chinese indentured labor. Following the Civil War, the U.S. had this more assertive federal government committed to ending this legacy of slavery. By the time of Reconstruction, the long debate about coolies had convinced many in the U.S. that coolies were slaves and that the Chinese were undesirable immigrants. Consequently, the government did not support the coolie trade and didn't favor planters. Although Reconstruction prevented coolie labor from flourishing, the linking of coolie labor to slavery helped lead to Chinese exclusion. So Reconstruction then largely prevented the exploitation of Chinese labor in the South, but it also contributed to the long-term marginalization of the Chinese in general in the United States. Southern planters failed compared to planters in Cuba and Peru but coolie labor still only lasted 3 decades in Cuba and Peru. The explanation for this, then, is of this long-term failure shares still some similarities with the South. All three developed an ambiguous discourse on coolies. In Cuba and Peru, these inconsistencies helped justify both Chinese immigration and exploitation. But these contradictions also made coolie labor vulnerable. Chinese resisted more and more, and their actions increasingly highlighted Cuban and Peruvian hypocrisy. Domestic and international pressure against coolie labor increased, and the Spanish-American coolie trade ended in 1874 with the closure of Macau. So the ambiguous discourse on coolies existed in the United States as well, but because of the timing of their efforts to establish the coolie labor system, in relation to larger domestic and international conditions, it actually stifled this project. Americans were convinced at that point that Chinese coolies were slaves and undesirable immigrants. Thus, in all three places, the ill-defined coolie played a role in the creation, inhibition, and destruction of the coolie labor system. Thank you. A little longer than I thought, sorry.
So we've got time for some questions, and I have a mobile mic, if I can remove it from the stand, so I can bring this to you. Any questions?
If I'm correctly informed, one of the characteristics of the Chinese labor force was that it was almost exclusively male.
Right.
Was that the case in all three countries? And if so, how was that maintained?
What do you mean by maintained? It is true, and I'll explain in a second, but what do you mean by maintained?
Anything from, in some areas I know there was a legal prohibition. You
Oh,
could not
okay.
bring
Yeah. Okay.
Chinese women into the United
Right,
States.
right.
In other circumstances, it could have been arranged by control of the transportation
Right.
system.
Okay, I see what you're
That
saying.
sense.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, in fact, it's even more male in Cuba and Peru than it was to the United States. 99.9% male. Basically, about 125,000 people I mentioned were almost all men. There's like 13 women. And you're right that so there's cultural components to that. The men emigrating, women staying home in China. There's in the United States the Page Act, which essentially was used to keep Chinese women out because they were linked to prostitution, and this became in the 1870s a way to sort of minimize, to stop Chinese female immigration to the United States. But before that, it's definitely more of this sort of decision in the U.S. West to go. And so that's why, even though it's still predominantly male, it's a little bit more female. But in Cuba and Peru, it's just really pretty much forced. People tricked, lied to, recruited, brought to what were called barracoons, told that they would have this opportunity, told Havana was the name of the ship they were getting on. And so the demand was for male laborers. And there were laws actually in the colonial government in Cuba and in Peru. They worried about this. And then there was some talk and actually a law in Cuba at one point that said a third should be women. But at the same time, they didn't really want real colonists, even though they called them colonists, right? They called them colonos asiáticos. But bringing over families meant that it was harder to exploit them, and it would suggest a long-term permanent presence, something that they didn't really want, despite the rhetoric that China was an advanced civilization, and this is a part of our white immigration efforts in Cuba, for example. So it's a little bit on both sides, but there's a labor demand and sort of a way of thinking that wanted male laborers in Cuba and Peru in particular, and then this fear of real immigration, even though most Chinese never left because they couldn't, so they just stayed. Yeah.
Other questions?
Thanks. Thanks for the talk.
Yeah.
If I caught the country context correctly, you were saying that the Chinese were legally white
Yeah.
in Cuba.
Yeah.
And can you just expand on some of those classifications and how that helped or hurt when it came
Sure.
to the Chinese workers?
Yeah. So Latin America, rich history, so-called racial mixing, right? Mestizaje, processes of mestizaje. The colonial period, ideas of caste and ways of classifying people based on their different racial backgrounds, still privileging whiteness. Cuba was a little bit different. I mean, those terminologies and ideas kind of existed, and they made distinctions between being black and being half black, for example. But in general, as a slave society in the 19th century, they sort of created more like a U.S. system of sort of a racial dichotomy of people of color, gente de color, meaning black. And there could be differences within that, but they generally divided the population that way, and blancos, whites. And it sort of reflected that idea of people of African descent should be slaved or enslaved or tied to slavery, and whites not. And so one of these fears was by like 1840, Cuba actually had a majority black population. And so there was this fear, right? Oh no, we are going to become the next Haiti. So there was all of these efforts on the part of white elites and government officials to promote white immigration. And later in the 19th century, white European immigration would take off. More Spaniards would start coming. But in the 1840s, they're experimenting. They're having a hard time. They import some Gallegos, people from Galicia in Spain, and Canary Islanders. And they actually import some Yucatecan Mayans and a few Irish as well under indentured relations. But it becomes really hard to sort of justify treating them the way that the planners want to do in their minds, because in their minds, white people shouldn't have to experience this type of abuse. And so they kind of give up on it. And in Mexico, the Yucatecan trade gets shut off by the Mexican government. They were sending imprisoned Mayans, but that stopped. But all of them, these projects were like done through the Junta de Fomento de Población Blanca, the junta, the body, public body, this official body trying to promote white colonization. So that's how it starts. And then later in the baptismal records, every time they're baptized, they're put in the Libro de Blancos, because they kind of only have these categories. In the census, the Chinese are listed as a subcategory of Asiáticos under white. And then in some court cases, it comes up again. And so in other stuff of my research, I look at a lot of criminal cases, and I look at like Chinese rebelling, and then the court testimony and their lawyers, and they often say, you're treating white people like slaves. You can't do this, right? And it doesn't usually free them, but it often stops them from getting the death penalty when they've committed murder. Like it's soft. They'll be like, there are these attenuating circumstances, so we won't like do the full punishment kind of thinking. And so they do at times, the Chinese themselves and their defenders point to this whiteness. So it creates a problem. But it's also one of the only ways to justify the project in the beginning.
Just a short question.
Yeah.
Are there Chinese communities in the South that can trace back to this period?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, definitely. And then moving in Mississippi, yes, there are. I think a later wave of moving in as well, early 20th century. But there are definitely still people, and there's still people descended from Chinese indentured laborers in Cuba and Peru as well. And Lima still has a bustling Chinatown, new Chinese migration in the 20th and 21st century. Most Chinese in Cuba, there was this lull and then a new wave in the early 20th century, but most Chinese left the country after the revolution. Not all, but most. But there's still a Chinatown, still Chinese societies in Havana, for example. The Mi Ching Tong is one of them. So they're still there, this long-term presence. But in the later period, so like in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. So, and by the 1870s, there are Chinese merchants with ties to San Francisco, Hong Kong, and stuff migrating to Havana as well, to kind of taking advantage of this Chinese population that's there, or seeing an opportunity, and then going to Lima as well. And that merchant sort of category, those people tended to have those ties and go back. And that was true in the earlier part of the 20th century as well. And then that was true all over Latin America as the Chinese presence grew.
I want to ask a question, kind of a follow-up on the last question.
Yeah.
To what extent is this historical experience, and particularly this form of labor exploitation tied to immigration, memorialized in public culture in any of these three countries? And I ask in part because I know that there is an Asian Peruvian population. There's a Chinatown in Havana and in major cities in the United States. And my very limited prior knowledge of any of this is based honestly on watching American Western movies, where there's always Chinese labor
like in the West,
associated with the railroad,
right?
But nothing connected to plantation labor and so forth. So to what
I
what
can't
extent is
speak
there-
for the U.S. South because I am a Latin Americanist, and I'm coming at it's like kind of just trying to rethink American history a little bit in terms of its connections to Latin America. But I can definitely speak to that question for Cuba and Peru. And the Chinese, despite experiencing like Chinese exclusion laws, which the U.S. imposed on Cuba in 1902 after the Spanish-American War, and that there's only one of the things the U.S. did before it left the island, after creating Cuba into a protectorate, was spread our laws to Cuba. The Chinese are viewed, even though they had this period of xenophobia and is everywhere in the hemisphere, they're viewed as heroes, as national patriotic heroes. The Chino Mambi. So Mambis, the Mambises were the Cuban rebels who started fighting in 1868 until 1878, the first Cuban Independence War, the 10 Years' War. And then there's the Little War, the Guerra Chiquita, 2 years later, that lasted a year. And then the final War of Independence, 1895, until the U.S. intervened in 1898. And the Cuban freedom fighters are known as Mambises. And these were multiracial armies. The war started in the east of the island. How do I get back to that? So so the eastern part of the island, this is where all independence wars happened in Cuba. This is where the Cuban Revolution really took off. Well, although urban stuff in Havana was important. Castro didn't want you to know that, but it was important too. But like Castro's stuff was over here in the east as well. So when you think of rebellion in Cuba, you think of the east. This was like the back country in Cuba in the 19th century. Isolated, underdeveloped. There was slavery, but the planters were poorer and they were upset, and so they rebelled in 1868. And the only way they could do it was to declare the end of slavery and have slaves fight. And 6,000 Chinese or so ended up joining the rebel army, fleeing the plantations or being freed and joining. And then they fought in the Little War, and they fought in the 1895 war. And there's a famous phrase by one of these promoters of Cuban independence from the 19th century, a good friend of Jose Marti, if you know that name, the famous Cuban poet, nationalist, etc. There never was a Chinese deserter, there never was a Chinese traitor. And there's a memorial in Havana near the American embassy, a big black obelisk with that phrase on it that was erected in the 1940s. Once Chinese exclusion laws ended, and Cuba and China were allies in World War II, and so that idea keeps happening. That's really important. I gave a talk in Cuba one time, and I was talking about all of these forms of integration of Chinese indentured laborers, but I wasn't talking about the wars because that's all people talk about. And then I got an angry person in the audience telling me, the only thing that matters is that the Chinese fought for Cuban independence. It's like, you missed the most important thing. I'm like, well, okay, well, we know that, but okay. Some didn't, too, and some fled from the rebellion. There's nothing like that in Peru. It's it's more now increasingly like discussion, sort of a, well, I should say about Cuba too, is since the revolution, there's been more of a idea of studying the history of slavery, of people's struggle, and so kind of upholding the Chinese in that way too. Like these ideas of the revolution has overcome exploitation. Let me tell you about 19th century, early 20th century exploitation. In Peru, there's nothing like that, really. There's some discussion now of this history, but a lot of forgetting. And discussions of Chinese sort of cultural food, as food becomes a big idea of their integration. And I think one of the explanations for that is that there were a lot of Chinese, several thousand, who fought with the Chileans in the 1879-1883 War of the Pacific, where Chile invaded Bolivia and Peru and stole the southern part of Peru with the nitrate fields and took Bolivia's coast. Bolivia had a coast, and since that war, it's been landlocked. And there was still some indentured Chinese at that point, like finishing out their last contracts. And the Chilean army landed and freed a bunch of them, and they just joined up and fought because they viewed them as liberators. It wasn't really that, it's really about personal liberation in both cases, but they're on the against the nation, whereas in Cuba, they're fighting for the nation idea. And so that leads to this forgetting. And also there were massacres of Chinese in Lima during that war and on plantations, and the merchants in Lima were supporting the Peruvians, so they just sort of they ignored one side of these complex stories.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. You forgot. Okay. Fair enough. Anybody else?
Was there any effort by, to the degree that there was centralized authority in China in this period, was there an international relations dimension? Did the Chinese in China try to protect their people here?
Not really at first. It was illegal to emigrate. So they were basically disregarded at first. Plus the Chinese government was really weak at this time, right? This is a period when China suddenly, after hundreds of years of being the most powerful place in the world, is being informally colonized by the West. But no, they viewed it as initially as, sort of only the scum of society would leave kind of thing. But there was a lot of popular protest in ports in China against these coolie recruiters, which were known as pig brokers. That's what they were called. And there were these violent attacks against them when they caught them because people were losing family members to this trade, and there was so much deception. So it was sort of popular opposition that forced the Chinese government to start to pay attention. And then the international community, Western international community, increasingly was putting pressure on China to do something, and on the Portuguese and on Spain and Peru to sort of stop this. And so the British were doing something similar, but they had more state oversight that allowed for a lot of the same abuses, but I think you could argue that there were some of the abuses were kept in a little bit more check because of the highly regulated nature of the trade, even though there's still a lot of overlap and similarities and people saying this is slavery and everything in the British Empire. But the British sort of wanted to protect their version of this, and they didn't want to compete with like Cuban sugar and things like that. So they became vocal critics of this, and they were the leaders in the anti-slave trade and all this, and the Anti-Slavery Society in the U.S. and Britain became really anti-coolie trade. So you look at the Anti-Slavery Reporter, there's tons of articles in it from this period about this. And so it was creating that international pressure. And so it finally got to Portugal to close Macau, but then the British in particular, but the U.S. participated as well, convinced the Chinese government to send a commission with U.S., French, and American representation to Cuba in 1874 to investigate, and also to Peru. And so they took depositions from thousands of Chinese laborers, and they're just basically like, I'm still alive, but I've been beaten a number of times, and this person committed suicide next to me. This person was killed. The ship was off. Like I've been forced to recontract for 20 years. And so that report came out after the closure of Macau, but essentially ensured that the efforts to renew the trade would not happen. And that's sort of when China really, some historians have argued that this issue by the 1870s was the sort of the thing that jump-started the Chinese government to try to take more of this international diplomatic role and be more concerned for Chinese abroad.
If there are no further questions, join me in a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
I hope you will see you again on November 10th, 7 p.m. at the Multicultural Center. We'll be talking with Bobby Martinez about art, labor, and community.
Good luck with the rest of your semester.